Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 24th, 2020, and today we're going to be discussing why Bernie Sanders is an electable Democrat for the 2020 presidential election. Pretty much we're going to be running through a 2020 electoral map prediction between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. This time a little bit of a different format. This way you already know that the expected outcome is a Bernie Sanders victory, and I'm just going to defend the reasons why I believe so. I'm going to go through each individual state and discuss the factors that impact Bernie Sanders as the potential nominee when he reaches the general election. As it looks right now, Bernie Sanders is the most likely candidate to become the nominee as it stands today, February of 2020. Things definitely can change, but there's no guarantee of such. And also, we're almost starting up until Super Tuesday, and Bernie Sanders has a pretty strong lead both delegate-wise and nationwide polling. So pretty much, I'm pretty comfortable discussing him as the frontrunner for the Democratic race and the most likely candidate for the Democratic nomination. So pretty much, just taking a look at this map, I filled in all of the safe states. That way, we're not going to waste time going through that. But the main states that the Democratic Party really needs to focus on is the Rust Belt. It's the same thing that you've been hearing all this time, except it's actually going to matter on November 3rd. The Rust Belt is the area that the Democrats neglected back in 2016. Bernie Sanders did not in the Democratic primary, and it showed. In the state of Michigan, Hillary Clinton was expected to win that by a pretty large margin. Bernie Sanders ended up winning it. It was one of the most embarrassing moments in polling history in a Democratic primary, and when it came down to the general election, Hillary Clinton ended up losing Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by less than 1%. It definitely seems more likely that a candidate who won in primaries in both Wisconsin and Michigan would be more likely to carry those states in the general election. The thing that the Democrats failed to realize that these states are no longer safe Democratic states. A lot of Democrats underestimated Donald Trump back in 2016, and they may end up doing it again depending on who the nominee is. Bernie Sanders, I think, definitely could resonate with white working-class voters if he plays his cards right. The Republican Party has yet to ramp up full-fledged attacks against Bernie Sanders in the aspect that they seem to not really view him as an immediate threat to the Republican Party, which in actuality he definitely is. He could completely transform policy practically overnight, day one, if he's entered into a Democratic Congress, possibly a Democratic Senate, looking at the elections coming up. Not super likely, but possible. 2022 midterms come around. It is possible the Democrats do pick up a few seats just the way the Republicans did in 2018, even if Bernie Sanders was unpopular the same way that Donald Trump was back in 2018. But pretty much, the Republican Party hasn't really focused too much on Bernie Sanders as much as they need to be if they genuinely want this man to no longer be the favorite to win the 2020 election. As it stands right now, Bernie Sanders is both the favorite to win the election and also win the nomination. And here's why. Pretty much, we already know certain states are going to vote in a certain category. States like Virginia and Colorado and Nevada are historically Democratic states in recent midterm and general elections, and also they just have the demographics that really will work well together with the Bernie Sanders voting group. Virginia, number one, definitely shown a lot more Democratic history, not only in recent elections, but if you go back further than that, and Colorado and Nevada as well. These are all historically Democratic states since the year 2008, and there's no other reason why they would change right now. Donald Trump is not doing anything but losing voters in these areas, and he didn't even win them in 2016. The only state that was reasonably close was the state of Nevada, in which Donald Trump was expected to win, ended up losing it. That was one of the 4 states that was incorrectly polled in the 2016 election. Bernie Sanders immediately starts off with 216 safe or likely electoral votes, not to say that there aren't other likely areas. When we're talking about candidates like Bernie Sanders, states like New Hampshire and Maine at large become, in total, likely states altogether. These are states that Bernie Sanders is definitely going to be focusing on, even though it's not too much in terms of electoral count. He's going to want to make sure that these are not swing states in 2016, like 2016. These are states that will be crucial if the election does come down to the wire. I generally do not believe that the election will come down to between 3 to 4 electoral votes, but again, the Democratic Party really needs everything if they want to defeat Donald Trump. But states like Texas, we know, are probably not going to go to Bernie Sanders, though the polling data currently suggests that Bernie Sanders may come within less than 5% on Election Day. I do not think that's the expected outcome in terms of my point of view. Texas is a Republican state. There are not many candidates that are running that I think could even come close to winning it. Bernie Sanders, I think, could be one of the top candidates that could come the closest in terms of winning Texas, but at the end of the day, it's still a Republican state. It's probably going to go to Trump by 5-6%. That definitely has some warning signs heading into 2024, 2022 midterms, future elections, but I don't think now is the time that Texas does end up flipping. Bernie Sanders, however, will be able to do well in states such as Minnesota. That is another state that I think will be considered likely for the Democratic Party, and I would also include the Rust Belt. Now, I understand that the Rust Belt is an area of contention amongst Republicans. A lot of them believe that Donald Trump still holds on to that base there, but none of the data suggests that. 2018, definitely not a good look for Republicans in the 3 Rust Belt states. In terms of data, based off of Trump's approval before the election versus after the election or right after he was inaugurated, none of it shows good numbers for Donald Trump. Comparing it to January 2017 to now, it's a drastic change. Almost double digits, if not double digits, in certain states that have moved Donald Trump into the disapproved column by a very large amount. And in states that were decided by less than 1% in 2016, losing any bit of support is going to make all the difference here. 22,000 votes in Wisconsin, 10,000 votes in Michigan. I believe somewhere around 40,000 in Pennsylvania. Could be off about that number. Way more sure about Michigan and Wisconsin, but less than 1% in all 3 states. Hillary Clinton very well could have won the 2016 election if she had focused more time in these 3 states. Bernie Sanders is definitely not going to make that same mistake again. Donald Trump did everything in his power to win those 3 states. He's going to need to bring a lot more than what he brought in 2016. And genuinely, I don't think it's going to happen. Bernie Sanders, probably out of all the other 2020 Democrats, has the cleanest record per se. He does not have too many scandals, and that's likely because he didn't dabble into politics as much as the other candidates did. We have a former vice president, we have a billionaire, a senator who's been outspoken even though she was only in the Senate since 2012. Bernie Sanders was an independent who caucused with the Democratic Party. He tended not to make anyone super angry, and genuinely, the only person that I don't think will be in full-fledged support of Bernie Sanders is President Barack Obama. And based off the 2016 numbers, Barack Obama may not be vital to winning this election. He did end off being a popular president, but he's definitely not the key base of Bernie Sanders' support in the Democratic primary as of right now. Donald Trump, I do think, will end up winning in states such as Georgia and North Carolina. These are 2 states that are still historically Republican states. Right now may not be the time to expect them to move over into the Republican column, into the Democratic column. They narrowly went in 2008, and I don't exactly see Bernie Sanders resonating with African-American voters than the first African-American president. Hillary Clinton came closer than other candidates would have in 2016, including Bernie Sanders, mainly because of her Obama ties. That doesn't seem to be the same effect that we're seeing in the Democratic primary now. But when it comes down to the general election, Republicans are still going to end up carrying both of these states by a lean margin. It's still going to be close, but it will be Republican regardless, and it is a winner-take-all scenario, so Donald Trump does get those electoral votes. Maine's 2nd congressional district, that one I do expect to go to Bernie Sanders. He's going to end up winning with or without Maine. If Maine's 2nd district or even Maine at large doesn't go to Bernie Sanders, I can almost guarantee that the Rust Belt is going to go as well. Bernie Sanders is one of the few candidates that can actually resonate with the white working class voters, actually speaks to them on a personal level in terms of where they're actually having issues with, whether it be the economy or healthcare or the government failing them in more ways than just those 2. Bernie Sanders definitely seems to have that genuine tone that could work with those voters. The reason why Donald Trump did so well is because he seemed to have that story that really made Hillary Clinton seem to be some type of elitist candidate that never resonated with white working class voters. It's pretty ironic that a billionaire is able to appeal to voters that are barely making it paycheck to paycheck in certain states, losing jobs, not as a knock to Donald Trump or to any of the white working class voters, but it just seems not too fitting of the scenario that they would be backing someone such as Donald Trump just at face value. Obviously, there were other factors that played in, but just a little side note in terms of what I personally saw in the campaign season. But the state of Iowa, New Hampshire, I don't know why I said New Hampshire, Ohio, these are 2 states that Donald Trump won by very, very large margins back in 2016. They were almost 10% of the vote, and genuinely I do think that Bernie Sanders can bring down those numbers. States such as Ohio and Iowa, I do think will be decided by a lean margin in favor of Donald Trump. Those 2 states, I definitely see Bernie Sanders chipping away at that Republican base. But at the end of the day, I'm not super comfortable in characterizing these as Democratic states. There were times when Bernie Sanders definitely was performing a little bit better. Even though he may not have been winning in the Democratic nomination, as of right now, Joe Biden still narrowly edges out Bernie Sanders in certain swing states. Democratic Party primary support does not always correlate to more general election support. That's just not how it goes because it is a Democratic internal polling group that is polled in terms of Democratic nomination data. Iowa and Ohio, these are two states that do have a history of voting for Democrats, but there's just been such a large margin in favor of Donald Trump that bringing that back is going to need drastic measures. And to be completely honest, I don't think that's going to be the major centerpiece of Bernie Sanders' campaign. A lot of this money is going to be focused on, and this campaigning is going to be focused on those three Rust Belt states and solidifying a victory for the Democratic Party. A victory is a victory regardless. 4 years is 4 years. Yes, you can enter into the election with a mandate if he is to win by a super large margin. However, I don't think that's the main focus of this 2020 election. Bernie Sanders is going to need to push policy, which can be done through a mandate. But at the end of the day, this election is still going to be close regardless of who the nominee is. And focusing extra money on Iowa and Ohio when generally they're not really into play until later on, which we may never see depending on how the data turns up after we hit seeing Bernie Sanders as the most likely candidate for the nomination. Then we could reassess both of those states. But generally, I do not think that they are going to come into play too much compared to states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Before, those states were considered Democratic states, and the general election candidates focused on those two. Now it looks like the Democrats are going to have to take a step back and focus money and campaigning and just overall attention to states that they didn't have to before, just so they can be assured that they will win this 2020 race. Nebraska's 2nd district, still a Trump district regardless. Unfortunately for Bernie Sanders, I do not see a Florida victory. The only Democratic candidate that actually has good support in Florida is Michael Bloomberg. For whatever reason, that is the weirdest thing to me. But Donald Trump, I do expect to win. I think it's going to be less than 1%. It's still going to be close. Bernie Sanders, I definitely think is going to focus on Florida because it's way more viable of an option than Ohio or North Carolina, Georgia, or Iowa, even though at times I would have said the opposite. But as of right now, this is how I personally believe the 2020 electoral map will end up looking in this one-on-one scenario. But right now, Florida, still a Donald Trump area, still a Republican area. Yes, they narrowly won in 2018, still won in 2016. 2014 wasn't a good look for Democrats. 2012 was a 0.3% margin for President Barack Obama. So it doesn't exactly have the best history of being a super big swing state. Yes, it has a lot of electoral votes, but I genuinely think that it typically leans right year after year, and election history does end up supporting that data. With a popular governor on the Republican side and not too disapproved new Republican senator with 2 Republican senators in total, I would say Florida, with just the overall support for Donald Trump there, could narrowly tilt into his favor. And Arizona, a lot of you guys have been saying that Arizona could possibly go for Bernie Sanders. Generally, I'm not seeing it. Arizona did not exactly go for progressive Democrats back in 2018. Kyrsten Sinema was anything but a progressive Democrat. And moving into the general election, well, Arizona is definitely going to be close, a lot closer than it was in 2016, which is why I've put it in the tilt column for Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, the candidates that typically do well in Arizona are centrist Democrats, whether it's a Senate election or a presidential election or an upcoming Senate election with Mark Kelly. A lot of these Justice Democrats or Bernie Sanders Democrats, they aren't resonating with Democratic voters or independent voters either. When it comes down to that primary, these centrist Democrats are winning it. And if it's a state that comes down to the narrowest of margins, if you're not getting the support that you need in this primary, even though Bernie Sanders could very well win it through a plurality vote, if you just total up the number of centrist Democrats versus progressive Democrats, or I guess history, even if there are more affiliated progressives, they aren't exactly voting that way when it comes down to Democratic primary season. And I do think that Arizona is going to come down to the wire. I do think that Donald Trump will narrowly end up carrying it, but at the end of the day, it's not going to make too big of an impact on this race. Again, Donald Trump could lose Arizona, still loses the election. Bernie Sanders, it could even afford losing states such as New Hampshire, maybe Nevada, possibly Maine. But generally, the rest of these states, or the states that I've considered likely and especially safe, I definitely think are going to go for their respective parties. Some of these states do have a tendency to move back and forth, such as Arizona or Florida, but I'm pretty confident in the rest of my calls. So that pretty much wraps up why Bernie Sanders could win the 2020 election, therefore making him a viable 2020 electable candidate. I never said that he was the most electable. I do have to re-review the data and moving forward through the Democratic primary and make an accurate, for myself, conclusion based off of that reanalysis. But as of right now, Bernie Sanders is the most likely candidate to become the Democratic nominee, and it looks like he's going to, if he faces off against Donald Trump, win the 2020 election as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.